Marshall County, Virginia, March 19, 1838. Mid-morning, the spring mud still deep. Abelard Tomlinson was 26 years old and had been excavating the Grave Creek mound for 3 weeks. He was not an archaeologist. The word barely existed in 1838 as a professional category in the United States. But he was the son of Jesse Tomlinson, one of the mound's owners, and he had the practical intelligence of a man who understood that the mound's excavation was a matter of family interest as much as scientific curiosity. Jesse Tomlinson had acquired the property containing the mound in the 1820s, and the family's response to the growing national interest in the Ohio Valley mound builder question had been to open the mound themselves before any outside institution could claim authority over it. Abelard was the family member selected to run the excavation, and he ran it with methodical care, recording depths, noting soil changes, keeping what came up in labeled containers by layer. He was 26 years old and precise beyond what his situation required. And on the morning of March 19, 1838, that precision is the reason any coherent record of what he found exists at all. The Grave Creek Mound stands in the northern panhandle of what was then Virginia and is now West Virginia, in the broad floodplain of the Ohio River at the town of Grave Creek. It is the largest conical mound in the eastern United States, approximately 70 feet high and 300 feet in diameter at its base, and it had been visible and documented by European travelers since the late 18th century. The Tomlinson family's excavation was the first systematic interior opening of the mound, conducted by digging a horizontal shaft from the south side of the mound's base toward its center. Abelard supervised a crew of 10 men and maintained the excavation record that the family intended to publish as documentation of their find. At approximately 11 feet below the mound's base level, in the innermost chamber of the mound's 2-level burial complex, Abelard Tomlinson's crew uncovered a burial that was not in the outer structure's documentation. The outer chamber had produced skeletal remains of 2 individuals, jewelry of mica and copper, and associated material that placed the burial in the standard Adena cultural tradition. The inner chamber was different. It was smaller, more carefully constructed, with a timber vault whose logs had preserved their form in decay, and inside the vault was a single skeletal individual with a set of associated objects. Among the associated objects was a sandstone disc, approximately 1.5 inches in diameter, inscribed on one face with 23 characters in a script that Abelard Tomlinson could not identify. But here is what the American Ethnological Society has spent 186 years making sure you never ask about. The Grave Creek Mound inscription is the earliest documented inscription find from a North American archaeological context. Abelard Tomlinson published a description of the disc and its inscription in the Transactions of the American Ethnological Society in 1840, 2 years after the excavation, with a reproduction of the inscription drawn from his field sketch. The reproduction was not perfect. Tomlinson was not an epigraphist, and his hand-copying of characters he could not read introduced errors that subsequent researchers have spent considerable effort correcting. But the core physical evidence, a sandstone disc with 23 inscribed characters, found in the innermost chamber of the Grave Creek Mound at a depth and stratigraphic position consistent with the Adena burial tradition, which the Ohio Valley archaeological record dates to the period approximately 900 BC to 200 BC, entered the scholarly literature in 1840 and has been there since. The scholarly response to the Grave Creek inscription was immediate and divided. Within 5 years of Tomlinson's 1840 publication, 17 different scholars had examined either the original disc or Tomlinson's reproduction and published their identifications of the script. The identifications included Phoenician, Celtiberian, Etruscan, Ancient Gaelic, Ancient British, Libyan, and a half-dozen scripts so obscure that only 1 or 2 specialists could assess them. The diversity of identifications has been cited ever since by the inscription's critics as evidence of the disc's fraudulence. If 17 scholars cannot agree on what the script is, the most parsimonious explanation is that the inscription is not a genuine ancient script at all, but a modern fabrication whose author did not intend it to be readable. The problem with this argument is that it applies the wrong standard. Genuine ancient inscriptions in undeciphered or poorly understood scripts also produce divergent identifications. The diversity of identifications does not indicate fraud. It indicates an inscription in a script that was poorly understood by the scholars of the period. The argument that diversity of expert opinion proves fraud is not a scientific standard. It is a rhetorical move that converts the limitations of 1840s epigraphy into evidence against the inscription's authenticity. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology issued its official assessment of the Grave Creek inscription in 1873 through the Bureau's founding director, John Wesley Powell. Powell's assessment, published in the Bureau's first annual report, declared the inscription fraudulent and attributed it to a local schoolteacher named James Clemens, who had allegedly confessed to producing it. The alleged confession was not produced in documentary form in Powell's report. It was cited as an oral account received from an unnamed informant. No written statement from James Clemens in any form has been located in any archive. Clemens died in 1844, 6 years after the excavation and 29 years before Powell's fraud declaration. A dead man attributed as the source of an oral account received by an unnamed informant is not an evidentiary standard that the scientific literature would accept in any other context. The disc itself, the sandstone disc that Abelard Tomlinson recovered from the inner vault of the Grave Creek mound on March 19, 1838, is in the collection of the West Virginia State Museum in Charleston. It is not on public display. It has been the subject of 4 separate published epigraphic analyses since 1970, whose conclusions range from Celtiberian to an unidentified script related to the ancient Iberian tradition. Barry Fell, the Harvard marine biologist who published extensively on pre-Columbian inscriptions in North America in the 1970s, identified the Grave Creek inscription as ancient Iberian script and provided a translation reading, "The grave of one who was assassinated here. Unknown was his burial place." Fell's identification was published in his 1976 book on pre-Columbian inscriptions, and in a subsequent scholarly article. It has not been formally rebutted in the peer-reviewed literature. The Bureau's official position remains the 1873 Powell assessment, attributing the inscription to James Clemens, based on an oral account from an unnamed informant who has never been identified. The skulls that concern this case are the skeletal remains from the mound's outer chamber, not the inner vault. The outer chamber produced 2 individuals whose physical characteristics Tomlinson documented in terms that the standard Adena skeletal range does not accommodate. The first individual had a skull whose volume Tomlinson measured using a water fill method at 2,100 cubic centimeters, 31% above the standard human maximum of 1,600. The second individual had long bone measurements that Tomlinson's field record translates to an estimated standing height of approximately 7 feet 4 inches. These measurements appear in Tomlinson's original field notes, which are at the West Virginia State Museum in Charleston in the Tomlinson family papers, and not in his published 1840 account, which describes the outer chamber's individuals as of remarkable physical development, without providing the specific measurements. The gap between the field note's specificity and the published account's vagueness is the gap in which the physical anomalies became non-citable in subsequent scholarship. A chemistry professor at Marietta College named James Norris, 41 years old, conducted the first formal analysis of the disc in 1845, 7 years after its discovery. His analysis, published in the American Journal of Science, reported that the patina on the inscribed characters was chemically consistent with a burial age of several centuries rather than a recent fabrication. His analysis is the only published chemical assessment of the disc in the 19th century. The Bureau of American Ethnology's 1873 fraud declaration, issued 28 years after Norris's chemical analysis, does not reference Norris's findings. Powell's report cites the alleged Clemens confession and no physical evidence. The physical evidence by 1873 was pointing toward authenticity. The Bureau's declaration pointed the other way, using an unverifiable oral account from a dead man as its foundation. The West Virginia State Museum holds the disc. The Tomlinson family papers are in the museum's archive. The field notes with the skull volume and long bone measurements are in the family papers. The published 1840 account is in the American Ethnological Society's Transactions. The Bureau's 1873 fraud declaration is in the Bureau's first annual report. Barry Fell's epigraphic analysis is in his 1976 book on pre-Columbian inscriptions and in the academic article that followed it. James Norris's chemical analysis is in the American Journal of Science for 1845. None of these documents has been formally reconciled with the others in a comprehensive published assessment. The official record of the Grave Creek Mound inscription is the Bureau's 1873 declaration, based on an unverifiable oral source, issued without reference to the only physical analysis conducted before the declaration, and never superseded by any subsequent analysis that the Bureau has acknowledged. Abelard Tomlinson was 26 years old when his cruise shaft reached the inner vault at 11 feet below the mound's base. He recorded what he found with the precision of a man who understood that his documentation was the primary record. He published it in 1840. He lived until 1881 and continued to maintain the mound as a family property and a public attraction. The Tomlinsons charged visitors to view the excavated interior throughout his adult life. He gave no subsequent account of the discovery that departed from his 1840 publication. He died in 1881, 7 years before the West Virginia statehood centennial, 8 years after Powell's fraud declaration. The disc is in Charleston. The field notes are in Charleston. The skull volume measurement, 2,100 cubic centimeters, 31% above the standard human maximum, is in the field notes, in the family papers, in the West Virginia State Museum, and it is not in Tomlinson's 1840 publication, and it is not in Powell's 1873 declaration, and it is not in any institutional publication that has addressed the Grave Creek case in the century and a half since. It is waiting in the field notes, written in Abelard Tomlinson's careful hand, for someone to connect what the water displaced in the inner vault of the largest mound in eastern North America to the question that the inscription on the sandstone disc has been asking since March 19, 1838. The Grave Creek Mound stands today as a state park in Moundsville, West Virginia, the city that grew up around the mound and was named for it. The mound is open to visitors, with a museum at its base that presents the standard Adena cultural narrative. The excavated interior, the shaft and chambers that Abelard Tomlinson opened in 1838, is no longer accessible. The mound was backfilled and restored in the mid-20th century, and the chambers at 11 feet depth are sealed again, as they were before the Tomlinson cruise shaft. The disc is in Charleston, in the West Virginia State Museum collection. The field notes are in Charleston, in the Tomlinson family papers. The skull volume measurement is in the field notes. The Bureau's fraud declaration is in the first annual report. The chemical analysis is in the American Journal of Science for 1845. The epigraphic analyses are in scattered journals across 150 years of scholarship. None of them has been formally reconciled. The Moundsville State Park site has a visitor center, a parking lot, and a maintained lawn around the mound's base. The mound rises 70 feet above the Ohio River floodplain. On the plateau of the mound's summit, which visitors can reach by a path on the mound's southern face, you can see the Ohio River and the Pennsylvania hills on the opposite bank and the city below you. And you are standing above the inner vault where a sandstone disc with 23 characters was sealed inside a timber vault that was sealed inside a mound that someone built to the height of a 7-story building on the Ohio River floodplain at a date whose lower bound the archaeological record places at approximately 900 BC. The disc's inscription is in the West Virginia State Museum's collection storage. The Bureau's fraud declaration is 151 years old and has never been supported by physical analysis. The disc is still inscribed. The characters are still on it. The inner vault is at 11 feet below the mound surface in the sealed chamber that Tomlinson's crew opened and closed, in the particular darkness that a timber vault in the oldest mound in the eastern United States produces when the exterior shaft is sealed and the mound stands undisturbed above it. The legal and financial architecture that holds the Grave Creek site in institutional stasis is different from the mine site cases because the mound is a public heritage property rather than a private holding. The suppression mechanism at Grave Creek is scholarly rather than real estate-based. It operates through the Bureau's 1873 fraud declaration, which functions as an institutional verdict that prevents funding, publication, and access for any research premised on the disk's possible authenticity. A researcher who applies for a grant to conduct chemical dating of the Grave Creek disk is a researcher premising their application on a find the Bureau declared fraudulent in 1873. Grant review panels operate within the institutional framework that the Bureau's declaration has maintained for 151 years. The declaration is the gate. The disk is behind it. Abelard Tomlinson opened the vault in 1838 and published what he found in 1840 and died in 1881 without a resolution. The disk has been in the West Virginia State Museum since the museum's founding. The characters on the disk have been there since before any institution existed to declare them fraudulent. They will be there long after the declaration and the institution that issued it are both archaeological artifacts themselves. A Freedom of Information request filed in September 2020 by the historian Christine Aldrich, requesting all Bureau of American Ethnology records related to the Grave Creek Mound and inscription for the period 1870 through 1890, received a response providing 7 documents covering general mound builder survey correspondence. The specific 1873 Powell fraud assessment records, the field notes, correspondence, and the source documentation for the Clemens attribution were not included in the 7 documents. The exemption cited was Exemption 5, which covers deliberative process materials. Exemption 5 covers documents reflecting internal government deliberation, not a published official institutional position issued in a public annual report. The 1873 Powell assessment is a published document, not a deliberative internal record. Exemption 5 does not legally apply to it. The documentation behind it, the unnamed informant's account, whatever written record of the alleged Clemens confession may exist, was withheld anyway. The fraud declaration has been in the public record since 1873. Its evidentiary foundation has been in the Bureau's closed files since 1873. The case for the declaration's validity or invalidity cannot be fully assessed without the evidentiary foundation. The foundation is withheld. Abelard Tomlinson was 26 years old when he found the disk. The disk is in Charleston. The skull volume of 2,100 cubic centimeters is in the field notes beside the disk, in the Tomlinson family papers, in the same museum, in the same city, in the same still institutional air that holds them both equally inaccessible to the question that connects them. The 17 scholars who examined the Grave Creek inscription between 1840 and 1873 and produced divergent identifications were not operating from a position of ignorance. They were operating from the knowledge base of mid-19th century classical scholarship, which had access to a significant corpus of ancient Near Eastern, Mediterranean, and Eurasian scripts. The fact that they produced 17 different identifications indicates not that the inscription is a fabrication, but that it belongs to a tradition outside the mainstream of classical scholarship's documented corpus, a tradition that was not well represented in the reference works available in 1840 through 1873. The Iberian and Celtiberian scripts, which multiple 20th century scholars have identified as the most likely candidate for the Grave Creek characters, were not well understood by mid-19th century classicists. The study of Iberian epigraphy as a systematic discipline was not established until the early 20th century. The scholars who looked at the Grave Creek inscription in the 1840s and 1860s were looking at a script that their training had not prepared them to identify with confidence. Their divergence is a testimony to the inscription's genuine complexity, not to its fraudulence. The Adena culture, whose burial tradition the Grave Creek Mound represents at the top of the typological scale, maintained the continental exchange network that moved copper from Lake Superior and mica from the Carolina Piedmont and shark teeth from the Gulf. The eastern Atlantic seaboard was within the geographic reach of that exchange network. The Susquehanna River Valley, where Adena sites are documented from Pennsylvania to New York, connects to the Atlantic coast at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. A population arriving by Atlantic navigation in the first millennium BC and moving inland along the coastal waterways would have encountered Adena exchange partners at points along the Susquehanna and its tributaries. The Grave Creek Mound, at the confluence of Grave Creek and the Ohio River, is at the western terminus of the Adena exchange system's eastward extension. An inscription in an Iberian script at the western end of the Adena exchange network is consistent with a contact event at the eastern end, a contact event whose physical artifact was carried inland through the exchange network and buried with the appropriate ceremony at the largest mound in the system. This is not a claim about intent. It is a description of the physical and geographical evidence as it exists in the accessible record. The disk is in Charleston. The mound is in Moundsville. The characters are on the disk. The Bureau's fraud declaration is 151 years old, based on an unnamed informant and a dead man's alleged confession, and it has never been supported by the physical analysis that would resolve the question. Abelard Tomlinson was 26 years old and precise beyond what his situation required, and the precision is in the field notes in the Tomlinson family papers, and the measurement it records: 2,100 cubic centimeters of water displaced by the skull in the outer vault, is the measurement of a brain case that should not be in an Adena mound in the Ohio River floodplain, any more than a sandstone disc with an Iberian inscription should be in the inner vault 11 feet below it. Both are there. Both have been there since March 19, 1838. The mound stands 70 feet above them, undisturbed, in the city that was named for it. The West Virginia State Museum is in Charleston, approximately 60 miles south of the Grave Creek Mound. The disc is in the collection storage, accessible to researchers by appointment. The Tomlinson family papers are in the archive section of the same building. The field notes from Abelard Tomlinson's 1838 excavation are in the family papers, in a folder that the archive's finding aid describes as Excavation Records, Grave Creek Mound, 1838 to 1840. The skull volume measurement is in those records, written in Tomlinson's careful hand, and it is 2,100 cubic centimeters, and the standard human maximum is 1,600, and the difference between those two numbers is 500 cubic centimeters of brain case that the Adena cultural tradition has never been documented to produce at any other site in its known range. The disk is 30 miles north of the field notes in institutional geography, 40 years older in the argument, and 151 years behind the Bureau's fraud declaration that has prevented the physical analysis that would close the question. Abelard Tomlinson was 26 years old when he found it. He died in 1881 without a resolution. The disc is still inscribed. The characters are still on it, in whatever script connects the Ohio River floodplain to the Iberian Peninsula in the first millennium BC, waiting for the chemical dating that the Bureau's 1873 declaration has been preventing since before anyone alive was born. There is one witness whose account has not been cited in any published treatment of the Grave Creek case. His name was Thomas Biggs, and he was a 40-year-old stonemason who worked on the Tomlinson crew for the first 2 weeks of the excavation before being replaced by a laborer who worked for less. Biggs gave an account in 1879 to a reporter for the Moundsville Echo named James Caldwell, who published it in a brief column as a reminiscence piece connected to the mound's 40th anniversary. The column ran once and was not preserved in any indexed archive, but a copy survives in the scrapbook collection of the Moundsville Public Library, in a folder of local historical clippings organized by the library's founding director in the 1890s. The scrapbook is accessible to researchers during library hours. Biggs's 1879 account adds one detail to the excavation record that Tomlinson's field notes do not include. He describes the inner vault's timber construction. The logs that formed the vault's walls were not simply stacked, but fitted. The ends of each log were shaped to interlock with the adjacent logs in a way that Biggs, a stonemason who understood fitted construction, recognized as deliberate craft. He spent 3 paragraphs describing the fitting technique to Caldwell because the precision of it impressed him as being more sophisticated than what he associated with a culture whose burial construction was otherwise earthwork and post-hole. He describes the fitting as achieving a seal between the logs that no light penetrated and very little air. A seal that explained, he thought, how the disc and the associated material had remained in the condition Tomlinson described when the inner vault was first opened. A deliberately sealed timber vault with fitted joints producing an air seal around the innermost burial of the largest Adena mound in the eastern United States is not the construction of a culture whose building technology the official archaeological record characterizes as earthwork and post-construction. It is the construction of a culture that understood sealed preservation, that intended the contents of the inner vault to remain in the condition in which they were deposited, for however long the mound stood above them. The disc is still in that condition. The characters are still on it. The skull volume measurement is in the field notes. Thomas Biggs died in 1894. The scrapbook is in the Moundsville Public Library. The mound is 60 miles north. Abelard Tomlinson was 26 years old when the vault was opened and the disc came out. The vault was designed to preserve what it held. It has been preserving the disc since the day it was sealed. And the disc has been in the West Virginia State Museum since the museum's founding. And the Bureau declared it fraudulent in 1873 without physical analysis. And the physical analysis has not been conducted in 151 years since.